This is Biology 160, Introduction to Anatomy and Physiology on the cardiovascular system. Let's take a look at the blood vessels now. So we've seen the heart, we've seen the physiology and the anatomy of the heart. Now let's look at the rest of the circulatory system. The parts of the system that actually take the blood and nutrients, oxygen, to all the parts of the body. So there's two main types of vessels here. We have what are called arteries and then also veins. But then in between those we have some smaller categories, vessels that are smaller in these different categories that have some functions as well. So when the heart is pumping, arteries are what take that blood away from the heart. Arteries are the largest vessels in the body, and then from there they start to get smaller. They branch out and become smaller and become what we call arterioles. And then we have what are called capillary beds. Capillaries are the very smallest blood vessels. They're so small, they're basically microscopic. They're so small that only one red blood cell at a time can fit through these little capillaries, and sometimes they even get squeezed a little as they're fitting through. Very, very small. The capillary beds, this is what is in contact with the cells of the body. So every cell in the body has to receive blood, and which has the oxygen and nutrients. The arteries, arterioles, the veins, and venules, those aren't doing any exchange, gas exchange to speak of, or nutrient exchange. It's at the capillary beds that this happens. So every cell in your body is in some way related to these capillary beds. So we go arteries, arterioles, the blood then moves through the capillary beds where it exchanges material with the cells. And then we have the vessels that are returning to the heart, the venules, which gather together to form the larger veins, eventually dumping into the vena cava. So let's look at the difference between arteries and veins. There are some similarities, but there are some differences as well. First of all blood vessels have three main parts. We have the first outer layer is called the first inner layer, the very inner layer of the blood vessel is called the tunica intima. And this is a very thin layer. It's an epithelial layer. One single layer of epithelial cells, very smooth surface. This allows for the blood to be flowing through the arteries, as you can see here, and the veins. Remember, we want a very smooth surface. If anything catches the blood and causes it to slow down or pool, then we're going to have the danger of a clot forming. And so we want this nice smooth surface for the blood to be able to move down, up and down the vessels that it's moving through. If it does become rough, that can lead to the problem atherosclerosis, and that's where you're getting a buildup of plaque in the vessels of the body. And what's happening in atherosclerosis is this inner layer here it can become rough. There can be other factors causing it, but one of the things is this inner layer of cells can become rough, and fatty material starts to catch on that and build up, and then other things can form as well. Cholesterol get caught there, fatty material get caught on it, and we start to get this buildup of plaque in the vessels, which is basically like a clog. It's like having a clogged pipe. It narrows the vessel. It can affect blood pressure, as we'll see. It can also cause blood clots to form, which can then break loose and can cause all sorts of damage. So this is the tunica intima. Underneath the layer of endothelium, we have a basement membrane. This is made of connective tissue. Then we have what's called the tunica media. So this is layer number 2, tunica media. So media meaning middle. And this is the smooth muscle layer. We have this both in the arteries and then also in the veins. Notice the difference in size here. And as we're looking at these three different layers, notice the differences between the different vessels. So the arteries and the veins have the same basic layer. That tunica intima is just one single layer of endothelium cells. And then they have the connective tissue behind that. Notice that there are some valves in veins that are not present in arteries, that are found in that tunica intima layer. And then we have the tunica media, the smooth muscle layer. In the arteries, the smooth muscle layer is very thick. In the veins, it's very thin. And then we have the external elastic lamina, which is and then we have the tunica externa, which is the outer layer of the blood vessels. And this is the layer that is mostly made up of connective tissue, and its job is to basically protect and hold those blood vessels in place where they are. You can also have some other things. So notice that there's some external elastic lamina here in the arteries. This is elastic tissue that'll help the arteries keep its shape. So the difference between the arteries and the veins is that in the arteries we have a lot of pressure. So the heart is pumping, and that pumping causes a pressure as the blood is moving out into these vessels. It's causing pressure on those vessels. So the arteries have to be able to receive that pressure without breaking, and so they have to be able to expand and then come back into their original shape without any problems. And so that's where this elastic tissue is going to come in, helping it maintain its shape. Also the smooth muscle as well, all helping maintain that blood pressure. In the veins, there isn't really any pressure. The veins are moving the blood back to the heart, but it's a very passive system. So the smooth muscle layer is very thin because it's not actively. It can contract and help move that blood along the veins, but it's not as active as the smooth muscle in the arteries. The diameter, the tunica media, the smooth muscle can also change the diameter of that artery, and that's going to affect the blood pressure. So it can cause it to constrict or to dilate, depending on the nervous system, how it stimulates those blood vessels. We also have the capillaries down here. Capillaries do not have all three layers that the others do. They're just that inner layer of endothelium, a single layer thick, because their job is to allow for transport, and so they don't want really thick walls on the capillaries, so that it can have this intimate relationship with the cells of the body. So like I mentioned, the arteries are thicker. They're actively moving the blood around the body as it's coming from the heart. So that heart is doing the pumping, but the arteries are helping that move around the body. Veins have much larger vessels. The inside, or what we call the lumen of the veins, is much larger on the inside than on the arteries. They also have these, because it's a passive system, we have these valves. And these valves keep the blood from flowing backward. So by the time the blood gets through the capillaries and into the veins, the blood pressure from the heart is essentially gone. So the veins have very low blood pressure. So as the blood is moving up the veins, because there's no pressure pushing it along, it may have a tendency to pool up or want to flow backwards. And that's what these valves do. Once it gets through these valves, they're one way, and so the blood isn't able to move back, and so that causes it only to move forward. Also, skeletal muscles help veins move that blood back into the heart. So the veins are found around skeletal muscles. As those skeletal muscles contract, that'll actually squeeze the vein and cause that blood to start moving back towards the heart. This can affect the stroke volume. So remember, one of the things that affects stroke volume is the amount of venous return. And so if you start exercising, start moving your muscles, that's going to cause your veins to start moving more blood back into the heart. That's going to increase your stroke volume. That's going to increase your cardiac output as you start to exercise. And we call this a milking action of the skeletal muscles. Okay, last thing is capillaries here. So capillaries are interesting because they can kind of be shut on and off. So all of our cells need blood, but at different times, if one part of our body needs blood, some of the capillaries to parts that don't need the blood may be turned off, if that makes sense. So what we have here is we have an arterial coming in, and in this arterial we have the blood. It's going to move down these capillaries. You have a main pathway through the capillary called the shunt, vascular shunt, And then we have these little cells that are little sphincters around the arteries that branch off of that. So it forms some sort of web that all the body cells are going to be in contact with. So under normal conditions, if this is all open, notice how the blood enters the capillaries, and then it can move into these side chambers, and it's going to get all the cells and the nutrients they need, and then it's going to move into the venule side of the capillaries, and then into the venules where it will move back to the body. Let's say, for example, it's a hot day. You're really hot. You're trying to get rid of that blood, the heat in the blood. What's going to happen is the capillary beds in your skin are going to open up and allow that blood to flow through close to the skin, so that can help evaporate off some of that heat and sweating and things like that. Let's say it's a cold day. In the cold day, you want to keep that blood away from the skin, because you're going to lose a lot of heat in the skin, and you're going to shut off the blood flow, except just a little bit, to the extremities. And so your capillaries are able to do that. So each of these little sphincters can close and cause those capillary beds not to get any blood flow through them. And so in this way, if it was a cold day, you'd be able to conserve heat, because as the blood is coming into this arteriole, into the capillaries, it's flowing right through the vascular shunt. It's not going to make it into the capillary beds, so you're going to be able to conserve that heat. So that's one of the functions of the capillaries as well. There's a whole bunch of different blood vessels. So all the blood vessels in the body can be named. We're not going to go through these right now, but I do want to point out a couple things here. One being that, so this is a picture showing all the major arteries in our body. I'm going to blow this up just a little bit so you can see a little bit better. One thing I want to point out here, though, arteries are named for the location where they're found. And so if you look at each of these names here, you'd be able to, I think, figure out their names according to where they're found. And in particular, those names, the anatomical names that we learned at the beginning of this semester. And also something to mention, that these blood vessels are continuous. So even though they're all named differently, it's one continuous blood vessel. So they're just named according to the regions. As a blood vessel leaves one region and enters another region, even though it's the same blood vessel, we didn't change blood vessels, we give it a new name. So, for example, here's the heart, of course. And what we have coming out of the heart, we have the aorta, which is the large main artery coming out of the heart. So we have the aorta coming out, we have the aortic arch, and then we move into the thoracic cavity, and at that point we call the aorta the thoracic aorta. And then it moves into the abdominal region, and we call it the abdominal aorta. It's still the same vessel, but we've named it a few different things. We have some vessels branching off, such as the ones going to the kidneys, so the renal arteries. And then we also have the gonadal arteries coming off as well. And then notice here the aorta is going to divide in half. And so we no longer call it the aorta. Now we call it the common iliac artery. So now it's become an artery. And then it's moving through, depending on where it goes, give it another name. We have the femoral, so then the artery reaches the femur. We call it the femoral artery, the popliteal artery. And then as it continues going down, it's going to become the tibial artery. And there's an anterior and posterior one of those. And then it gets down into the feet. We call it the dorsalis pedis artery, arcuate artery, and then it's going to move into the veins. So it's pretty interesting how these are named, just according to the places where they go. Off of the aorta, we have some blood vessels that are branching off. A couple are going to go straight up to the brain, and those, of course, are very important. The carotid artery. We'll see the carotid arteries again here in just a minute. So we have the carotid arteries that are coming up to feed the brain. We also have the vertebral artery. And then we have the brachiocephalic trunk that is going to go to the different, to your two arms, basically. So we have the subclavian artery. The brachiocephalic trunk becomes the subclavian artery that goes down into your arms, and then it's going to become the brachial artery, It's going to become the ulna and the radius and the ulna arteries as it branches off and continues down. So anyway, so you can take a look at that and see how these different things are named. There's also some here in the digestive tract that are important, that are coming off to feed the digestive tract as well. So those are the arteries. The veins, once you know the arteries, the veins are easy because they're basically named the same, but they're called veins as opposed to arteries. So there are a few differences. We have the jugular veins, which are emptying the brain and the neck. You may have heard of the jugulars before. But in general, these are going to be the same, as they're going to have the similar names to the arteries. But the veins are going to be more superficial. As you know, if you look at your arms, you can see your veins, whereas the arteries are closer to the bones in order to help protect them more than the veins need protected. One other thing to mention here is that the veins are moving back towards the heart as opposed to away from as the arteries, and that they all eventually empty into the vena cava. There's a superior vena cava and there's an inferior vena cava somewhere. There it is, inferior vena cava, and those are dumping back into the right atrium after all this blood has moved around the heart, around the body. Let's take a few minutes here at the end and talk about blood pressure. So blood pressure is dealing with the pressure in the arteries. So this is how much pressure is in the blood as it's moving around the arteries. When we talk about blood pressure, we talk about systolic versus diastolic. And we've already seen systole and diastole when we're talking about the heart pumping. So systole is when the ventricles are contracting, also the atria are contracting. The diastole is when they're relaxing. So same thing here. So systolic pressure is the pressure when the ventricles of the heart are pumping, and diastolic pressure is when they're relaxing. And so this is what we're measuring when we take somebody's blood pressure. And so we write this number. So when you think of blood pressure, for example, 120/80, which is kind of the average blood pressure, this 120 is relating to the systolic pressure. That's how much pressure are on the arteries or on the blood vessels when the ventricles are pumping, actively pumping, and then the 80 is the amount of pressure that is there when they are relaxing. So notice here that even when the heart is not pumping, there's still pressure. So those blood vessels maintain that pressure even after the heart starts pumping. That's why they have to come back to their former shape. You don't want your blood pressure to go to zero even when the heart isn't pumping. So we have these two numbers here. As you get farther and farther away from the heart, that blood pressure is going to decrease until when you get to the veins, it's basically gone. So we use the arteries to measure the blood pressure, and usually the artery going right through the elbow is the one often used, as I'm sure you're familiar with. And this shows the blood pressure as it moves through the body. So we started at the aorta, and here we have this large blood pressure, and it's moving between the systolic and diastolic blood pressure. So as it's going, and then as we get to the arteries, it's getting less. And then to arterioles, it's getting less. And then once we get to capillaries, we're getting close to no pressure at all. And by the time you get to the venules, the veins, we've now reached a minimum blood pressure. It's gone. It's almost gone. Not even noticeable. So the way that we take blood pressure is we use the brachial artery, the one going through the arm. And so what we're going to be doing is we're going to be measuring the pressure of the blood when it's going through, when the heart is pumping versus when it's not. So you put on a little cuff, and you inflate this cuff. And what that does, when you inflate the cuff up above, usually above 120 millimeters of mercury, when you do that, you're not going to hear anything. So you put your little stethoscope on, and you shouldn't hear anything, because what's happening is you've put pressure on this cuff. You've put so much pressure that you've closed off that artery. You've basically made a tourniquet here. So you don't want to leave this on forever, of course, and usually blood pressure doesn't take that long to take. But anyway, so you've cut off all of that pressure so you don't hear any sound. So then what you do is you start to open up that cuff. You allow a little bit of blood to start pumping through. When you first hear the blood starting to move through, that tells you how much pressure there is, because there's enough pressure now that you've opened it a little bit. There's enough pressure in the arteries that it's getting through that tourniquet. So that tells you how much blood pressure there is when the heart is actually actively pumping. And again, that's usually going to be about 120 millimeters of mercury. And then you continue to open it, and you open it until you can't hear the sound anymore. And then that tells you how much pressure there is when the heart is relaxing. And that's going to be around your 70 to 80, your diastolic, your pressure. And so you write down those two numbers. And so that's the way that we take blood pressure. So what exactly does the blood pressure mean? Well, blood pressure is a measurement of the cardiac output, which we've already talked about, how much blood is being pumped from the heart, and then also what we call the peripheral resistance, or the friction that is in your blood vessels as it's flowing through those blood vessels. Blood pressure can vary person to person, time of day, day to day. There's lots of things that can affect blood pressure. So your age, your weight, time of day, exercise, even your body position, whether you're lying down versus standing up, that's going to affect your blood pressure, your emotional state. So blood pressure is very dynamic. It's not set, it's always changing, but again, we want to stay within some sort of okay range. So there can be problems if blood pressure gets too high or blood pressure gets too low. But the way you figure it out is you take that cardiac output, you find the cardiac output, and you multiply that by the peripheral resistance. So here's some things that can affect your blood pressure. Let's look at the cardiac output side, which is something we've already touched on. So first of all, you can affect your cardiac output. So if your heart rate increases, let's say you start to exercise, your heart rate increases, that's going to increase your blood pressure because you've now increased your cardiac output. This can be controlled by your sympathetic, your fight versus flight. Also, if you if you get scared, your heart rate's going to increase. That's also going to increase your blood pressure. So if you're stressed over long periods of times, you may have problems with high blood pressure. Also, stroke volume. You can also increase the stroke volume. And the way you can do this is the ways we talked about before. So there's hormones, there's the ions as well. For example, the kidney, if it conserves salt, that'll also pull in more water. The water is going to increase the amount of fluid in your blood, and that's going to cause an increase in stroke volume, which is going to increase your cardiac output, which will increase your blood pressure. So if there's a lot of salt in your diet, that can also affect your blood pressure. Your body can also affect this itself. So for example, let's say again that your blood volume decreases, so you're losing blood. That's going to trigger your kidney to also hold back to conserve salt, which will also conserve water and cause that stroke volume to increase, so to keep your blood pressure where you need it. So again, you don't want your blood pressure to go too low or too high, and so all these mechanisms are in play to try to keep it at where it needs to be. What about peripheral resistance? What causes peripheral resistance to change? One can be increased blood viscosity. Viscosity means the fluidity of the blood, how thick the blood is. So if you increase the blood thickness either by more red blood cells, so let's say you move to a higher elevation, you're going to increase your blood viscosity. That's going to increase your peripheral resistance, increase your blood pressure. There's chemicals that can also affect your blood pressure by constricting the blood vessels. So the arteries can constrict in order to increase the blood pressure, and this can happen for a number of reasons. Again, if you're losing fluid, you want to maintain that same blood pressure, and so your arteries, your blood vessels will constrict in order to increase that peripheral resistance, which will keep your blood pressure where it needs to be. And so you see this in someone that's losing blood pressure, losing blood and things like that. Also, there's chemicals, renin, renin is a chemical that is released by the kidneys that will set off a series of events that will cause the blood pressure to rise by performing angiotensin II, which constricts the blood vessels, causes the peripheral resistance to increase, and your blood pressure will go up as well. Also, other chemicals, the postural changes. When you stand up very quickly, your blood is all going to pool at your feet. That's going to cause your blood pressure to go down. And that's why when you stand up really fast, sometimes you get kind of that blackout feeling, because the blood's not actively getting to where it needs to be, to the brain. And so that triggers your vessels to constrict, which causes your blood pressure to go back up and resume its former where it was formerly. So those are the kinds of things that can affect blood pressure. We have neural factors, we have renal factors, which we talked about. Temperature can also affect blood pressure, as well as chemicals, and then also your diet can also affect your blood pressure. So all of these things go into play here. So, like I said, the rate can change, but normally you want your systolic pressure between 140 and 110, and then your diastolic between 80 and 75. If you have low blood pressure, it's often associated with illness, and if you have high blood pressure, this can be a problem if it's chronic, if it happens over long periods of time. Hypotension, or low blood pressure, so the hypo meaning low, may be associated with illness, but it may just be differences from person to person, and healthy elderly people often have lower blood pressure as well. Hypertension can be more dangerous because your heart is having to work harder because of increased peripheral resistance, and so it's putting pressure on both your heart because it has to pump harder, and that may eventually lead to heart failure. Also, because of this increased blood pressure on the blood vessels, it can cause tears in the tunica intima, which can lead to atherosclerosis, or the blocking of your veins, of your blood vessels, your arteries, which can cause problems as well, and eventually may lead to death if it continues. And so, blood pressure is very high blood pressure can be very dangerous. And there's a lot of factors that can affect it. Sometimes you don't really know what causes high blood pressure, but diet, obesity, even your hereditary, your race, and stress all can be involved in causing high blood pressure. Interestingly enough, women more than men, and more blacks than whites are hypertensive, or in other words, have high blood pressure. So that's blood pressure. I went a little bit long on this section, I guess, but that's all the parts. That's all we need to talk about the blood vessels of the body.